In the tangled, humid jungles of Vietnam during the 1960s and early 1970s, an invisible menace lay in wait. Hidden beneath the foliage, buried in the soil or disguised within the trees, it wasn't always a soldier with a gun that claimed lives. It was something far more insidious and often far more terrifying. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, facing the massive firepower of the United States, employed one of the most fearsome arsenals in guerrilla history. Deadly, improvised traps designed not just to kill but to dismember, traumatize, and psychologically destroy. These weren't just weapons. They were silent predators, crafted from wood, metal, and mud, built by hand, and designed to exploit every weakness of the American soldier. From the infamous punji pit, lined with sharpened bamboo spikes smeared in rot, to the bamboo whip trap, a slashing, spring-loaded nightmare, these devices weren't just meant to spill blood. They were meant to paralyze armies with fear. As the ancient Chinese strategist Sun Tzu once said, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." The Vietnamese didn't just take that to heart, they perfected it. By mastering the art of psychological warfare, they turned the jungle into a living nightmare. They forced US troops into a constant state of terror, never knowing if the next step would be their last. Fear spread faster than bullets, and trust in the terrain, in their very surroundings, dissolved. These traps weren't high-tech, but they didn't need to be. Their genius lay in their simplicity. Their horror lay in their cruelty. A deep dive into Viet Cong guerrilla tactics. During the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong, a communist guerrilla force fighting against the United States and South Vietnam, became infamous for their cunning and deadly strategies. Their tactics were not just effective, they were revolutionary. So much so that the phrase Viet Cong guerrilla tactics became synonymous with innovation in asymmetrical warfare. Operating in the dense jungles, muddy rice paddies, and rugged terrain of Vietnam, the Viet Cong faced an overwhelming military giant. The United States had superior weapons, advanced technology, and nearly limitless resources. But the Viet Cong had something more powerful: intimate knowledge of the land, unwavering commitment, and a strategy built entirely on survival and psychological warfare. By the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, the Viet Cong had developed an intricate, highly effective combat doctrine. One of their key strengths was their ability to blend in with the local population. Fighters could disappear among villagers by day and strike under cover of darkness by night. This seamless integration made them nearly impossible to isolate, let alone destroy. The landscape of Vietnam itself became one of their greatest weapons. Every slope, tree, and cave was a tactical opportunity. They used it to confuse, trap, and ambush enemy forces, and they fully understood that their most valuable asset was surprise. Surprise, striking at the moment when the enemy least expected it, was the soul of their strategy. One of the cornerstones of Viet Cong tactics was their underground tunnel network. Among the most famous were the Cuchi tunnels, a vast subterranean complex near modern-day Ho Chi Minh City. These tunnels allowed guerrillas to move silently beneath villages, slip behind enemy lines undetected, and vanish into the earth after an ambush. But these tunnels weren't just for mobility, they were fully functional ecosystems. They contained sleeping quarters, weapons caches, kitchens, hospitals, meeting rooms, and even classrooms. In the pitch-black underground, the Viet Cong could live, plan, and fight, completely invisible to the outside world. Today, these same tunnels are a tourist attraction, a testament to the resourcefulness and iron will of the Vietnamese guerrillas. Yet if there's one tactic that defined the Viet Cong more than any other, it was their use of traps. Ingeniously brutal and terrifyingly effective, their traps were created using the simplest materials: wood, bamboo, nails, rope, animal bones, and yet they inflicted horrific injuries. These devices weren't always intended to kill. In many cases, the goal was to maim or psychologically unhinge enemy troops. Take, for example, the punji stake, a sharpened bamboo spike hidden in a concealed pit. Often coated in feces, urine, or rotting animal flesh, these spikes caused devastating wounds that almost always led to infection. For the Viet Cong, this was a calculated decision. A wounded soldier required rescue, transport, medical supplies, and a team to care for him. One trap could take 5 or 6 men out of combat without firing a single bullet. The effectiveness of these traps lay in their unpredictability. They could be hidden along trails, inside abandoned buildings, behind doors, or even disguised as children's toys. They shattered the soldiers' trust in their surroundings. Every tree, every path, every step was suspect. At the heart of the Viet Cong's guerrilla doctrine was General Vo Nguyen Giap, the strategic mind behind some of their most successful campaigns. His famous quote captures the soul of their resistance. "We will fight the enemy with our cunning and make them die in their anger." It was never about overpowering the US with force. It was about outsmarting them, using fear as a weapon. Beyond traps like the punji pit and bamboo whip, the Viet Cong employed a variety of deadly improvisations. Booby-trapped grenades, modified to explode upon lifting a ration can or tripping over a vine. Hidden landmines, like the infamous Bouncing Betty, that exploded at waist height to inflict maximum damage. Drop traps and net snares that immobilized soldiers and left them exposed for ambush. Even poisonous animals, venomous snakes, scorpions, were placed inside traps or thrown into sleeping quarters to induce panic. No element of psychological warfare was off limits. In some cases, they even contaminated food or water supplies to sow illness and paranoia among troops. The goal was simple: to erode the enemy's confidence, push them into constant anxiety, and ultimately break their will to fight. The jungles of Vietnam were haunted not by spirits, but by an enemy that could be anywhere and anything. Uncovering the secrets of the Cuchi tunnels, beneath the soil of southern Vietnam, a hidden world existed. One that stretched for more than 250 kilometers. This vast underground labyrinth, known as the Cuchi tunnels, played a crucial role in the Viet Cong's guerrilla warfare strategy during the Vietnam War. Constructed between the late 1940s and the 1960s, the tunnels extended from the outskirts of Saigon all the way to the Cambodian border. They were not merely hiding spots, they were fully functional underground fortresses. These tunnels provided the Viet Cong with a secret base of operations, allowing them to launch ambushes, move supplies, and vanish into the earth without a trace. Living inside the Cuchi tunnels was brutal. The Viet Cong fighters stationed there endured extreme heat, poor air circulation, and the constant threat of discovery. Yet, despite these hardships, the tunnels were astonishingly well equipped. Inside, guerrillas had everything they needed to survive underground for weeks, sometimes months. There were sleeping quarters, storage rooms, command centers, kitchens, and even underground hospitals where wounded fighters received treatment. Many of these areas were dug out by hand, sometimes using nothing more than simple tools or even bare hands. All of it was concealed beneath villages, forests, and rice paddies. The tunnels weren't just dug in straight lines, they were intricately engineered across multiple levels, with hidden doors and escape routes designed to confuse and repel enemy forces. Some entrances were disguised as termite mounds, while others were hidden under the floors of rural homes. In some cases, entry points were submerged beneath rivers or rice fields, accessible only to those who knew their location. What made the tunnels even deadlier were the booby traps embedded within them. Tripwires, punji stake pits, and hidden explosives were scattered throughout the passageways, waiting for unwelcome intruders. The tunnels didn't just offer shelter, they were active killing zones for any enemy foolish enough to venture inside. The existence of these tunnels remained largely unknown to US and South Vietnamese forces until the early 1960s. Once discovered, they quickly became a priority target, but finding and clearing them was no easy task. The US military created special units to confront the challenge, soldiers known as tunnel rats. These were typically small, nimble volunteers who agreed to crawl into the cramped, pitch-black tunnels with nothing but a flashlight and a sidearm. Their mission? Locate enemy combatants, dismantle traps, gather intelligence, and clear the tunnels, inch by inch. The danger was constant. Every twist of the tunnel could hide a tripwire, a pit, or a waiting enemy. One such tunnel rat, Sergeant Samuel Orozco, once said, "You never knew what was waiting around the next bend. A wire, a snake, or maybe even a Viet Cong soldier with a knife." These men were some of the bravest in the war, operating in suffocating darkness, often alone, always one wrong move away from death. Despite the heroism of the tunnel rats and repeated military operations to destroy the network, the Cuchi tunnels remained a persistent and overwhelming challenge. The Viet Cong's intimate knowledge of their subterranean system allowed them to set ambushes, disappear in seconds, and keep their enemies disoriented. Two of the most significant confrontations involving the tunnels were the Battle of Cuchi in 1966 and Operation Cedar Falls in 1967. During the Battle of Cuchi, American forces launched a massive assault aimed at wiping out the Viet Cong presence in the area, but once again, the guerrillas slipped away through hidden exits, regrouping to fight another day. It was a pattern that repeated itself time and time again. Operation Cedar Falls was a full-scale search and destroy campaign aimed at clearing the Iron Triangle, a region that included the Cuchi tunnels. The operation succeeded in destroying large sections of the network. However, it didn't take long for the Viet Cong to rebuild and resume their guerrilla campaign. The tunnels represented more than just military engineering. They were a symbol of Viet Cong resilience, a testament to their ingenuity, adaptability, and sheer will to resist. No matter how many bombs fell or how many soldiers marched over them, the tunnels kept breathing, kept hiding, kept fighting. Today, the Cuchi tunnels stand as a living reminder of the underground war, of a battlefield hidden beneath the earth, where shadows moved silently and danger waited at every turn. The dark side of bamboo. During the Vietnam War, one of the most chilling examples of turning nature into a weapon came in the form of the punji stick. Crafted from sharpened bamboo and hidden just beneath the surface of the earth, these simple yet devastating traps were a hallmark of Viet Cong ingenuity and cruelty. With little more than wood, poison and mud, the Viet Cong turned their homeland into a graveyard of sharpened spikes. Punji sticks were deceptively simple. A hole would be dug into the ground, often only a foot or two deep, and filled with sharpened bamboo stakes, pointing upward. These stakes were usually arranged tightly, so that no matter where a soldier stepped, at least one spike would impale the foot, leg, or worse. In many cases, the holes were camouflaged with grass, leaves, or thin mats of woven twigs, making them nearly impossible to detect. The goal wasn't always to kill. In fact, it often wasn't. The true intent was to injure and terrify. A soldier impaled on a punji stake would scream in agony, attracting attention, halting the unit, and requiring medical evacuation. His pain was only the beginning. The wound itself, though small, was often made infinitely worse by what coated the tip of the spike: human or animal feces, rotting meat, plant-based toxins, or other infectious substances. This ensured that even a minor puncture would quickly become a festering, infected injury. Without swift medical care, gangrene or sepsis could set in, and in the humid, bacteria-filled jungles of Vietnam, even a foot wound could become a death sentence. Punji stick traps were typically deployed along jungle trails, riverbanks, and narrow paths where US and South Vietnamese troops were likely to walk. They were also placed around Cuchi tunnel entrances, adding yet another layer of defense against infiltration. Many were clustered in high-traffic areas, designed not only to injure one soldier, but to cause widespread panic and disruption across entire units. Though the most infamous use of punji sticks occurred during the Vietnam War, their origins stretch back further. Viet Minh guerrillas used similar traps against French colonial forces during the First Indochina War. However, during the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong elevated them to a whole new level of lethality. Their designs became more complex, their deployment more strategic, and their psychological impact more devastating. One of the most well-documented encounters with a punji trap came from Private First Class Frank Harbert, a US Marine on patrol in 1968. Harbert stepped onto a concealed trap during a routine sweep. I felt a stabbing pain in my foot. Before I even understood what had happened, I was on the ground screaming in agony. His injury, while not fatal, took him out of the fight and required weeks of recovery. It was a perfect example of what made these traps so effective. They removed manpower from the battlefield, slowed operations, and rattled the nerves of everyone left standing. The psychological impact of these traps cannot be overstated. Soldiers became paranoid. Every step became a decision between safety and sudden pain. The invisible threat of bamboo spikes made them cautious, slower, and far more vulnerable to ambushes. The US military and their South Vietnamese allies took various measures to reduce the risk. Specialized boots with reinforced soles were developed to resist the force of a spike. Units often sent point scouts ahead to probe the terrain with sticks or metal rods, trying to detect hidden traps before they claimed a victim. Soldiers were also trained to recognize signs of freshly disturbed earth, unnatural clearings, or subtle vegetation shifts, signs that a punji trap might be waiting. But the Viet Cong were always adapting. As Allied forces improved their defenses, the traps became more sophisticated. Some punji setups involved spring-loaded mechanisms that would launch spikes upward into the leg or groin of a passing soldier. Others used hinged bamboo arms that clamped shut around a limb, crushing it between sharpened sticks. Some even incorporated rotating spikes, designed to twist into the wound as the victim tried to pull away. No matter how many precautions were taken, the fear remained. Punji traps didn't just damage bodies, they undermined confidence, destabilized unit cohesion, and left soldiers constantly looking at the ground instead of the horizon. In the jungle, that kind of distraction could be fatal. To this day, the punji stick stands as a grim reminder of how something as simple as bamboo could be turned into a weapon of war, and how psychological warfare doesn't always need bombs or bullets to succeed. Traps and landmines in the Vietnam War. The Viet Cong's use of traps and landmines during the Vietnam War was not only a demonstration of their ingenuity, but also of their mastery of psychological warfare. These devices, ranging from crude, improvised contraptions to highly effective and lethal mines, exploited the deepest fears and vulnerabilities of US and South Vietnamese troops. They weren't just weapons, they were psychological tools designed to demoralize, disorient, and devastate. Among the most feared was the Bouncing Betty, officially known as the S-mine. Originally developed in Nazi Germany during World War II, this mine had a uniquely terrifying mechanism. When triggered, it didn't explode immediately. Instead, it launched upward to about waist height before detonating, sending a lethal spray of shrapnel in all directions, ripping through limbs, organs, and bone. The Viet Cong acquired these mines from captured enemy stockpiles and clandestine shipments from sympathetic nations. For the soldiers who encountered them, the Bouncing Betty was a symbol of inescapable danger. But the Bouncing Betty was just one of many traps employed. The Viet Cong made use of toe poppers, small landmines designed specifically to maim rather than kill. A soldier who stepped on one might lose a foot or a leg, requiring medical evacuation, tying up resources, and terrifying nearby comrades. These devices served the dual purpose of injuring the body and attacking morale. A single mine could halt an entire unit's advance. Another common tactic involved tripwire mines, often hidden along jungle trails or inside abandoned structures. A barely visible wire stretched across a path might detonate a concealed grenade, a directional mine, or a booby-trapped container. In many cases, these wires were almost impossible to spot, blending perfectly with the surrounding foliage or camouflaged beneath leaves and dirt. What made these traps especially effective was their deceptive simplicity. The Viet Cong often disguised them as ordinary objects, a pile of rocks, a clump of dirt, or a harmless-looking bush. Some traps even resembled military gear, tempting soldiers to investigate what they thought was a dropped item, only to trigger an explosion. One of the most infamous Viet Cong innovations was the can grenade trap. This rudimentary yet deadly device consisted of a hand grenade inserted into an empty food can, with the pin held in place by a stretched rubber band. The trap was placed along trails, in foxholes, or hidden in abandoned shelters. If a soldier kicked or moved the can, the rubber band would slip, pulling the pin and detonating the grenade. Simple, silent, lethal. These traps weren't just random hazards. They were carefully planned elements of a broader strategy to exhaust and demoralize the enemy. As stories spread through the ranks of soldiers losing limbs or lives to unseen traps, a sense of paranoia began to take hold. Every step forward could be the last. Soldiers began to question their surroundings, their movement, even their safety in places they thought were secure. One US soldier, Leonard Thompson, shared his experience. "You never knew when it was going to happen. Every step could be your last, and that weighs heavy on your mind." The mental toll was devastating. The Viet Cong didn't need to face their enemies head-on. Their traps fought for them, ambushing mines as much as bodies. To counter this invisible threat, American and South Vietnamese forces developed a series of countermeasures. Specialized mine detectors and bomb disposal units were deployed across key areas. Infantry units received training to spot likely trap locations, such as trail junctions, creek crossings, and abandoned structures. Soldiers learned to read the jungle in a new way, not just for enemies in the trees, but for danger hiding in the dirt. They probed the ground ahead of them with bayonets and metal rods. They moved cautiously, often sending scout teams ahead to sweep for mines before the main force advanced. The military also began conducting aerial reconnaissance missions to identify suspected minefields from above. While helpful, Even this strategy had limitations. Many traps were simply too well camouflaged to be spotted from the sky. And still, despite all the precautions, the traps kept killing. The genius of the Viet Cong lay in their ability to turn even the most mundane object into a weapon. A discarded ration can, a loose floorboard, a stick leaning against a tree, any of these could conceal a death sentence. The jungle became a maze of uncertainty and fear, where the ground itself was the enemy. The use of traps and landmines in Vietnam did more than wound soldiers, it broke spirits. And in a war where morale was everything, that made them one of the Viet Cong's most effective tools. Viet Cong net and pitfall traps. Among the many sinister tools used by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War, net traps and pitfall traps stood out for their unsettling simplicity and terrifying effectiveness. These devices were not just physical threats, they were psychological weapons designed to instill paranoia, break confidence, and render soldiers vulnerable at the most unexpected moments. The net trap, often referred to as a man catcher, worked by entangling unsuspecting soldiers in a large camouflaged net hidden along the jungle floor. Typically made from thick rope or durable vines and covered with leaves, branches, or natural debris, the net was connected to a hidden tension system, usually a tripwire or pressure trigger. When triggered, the system would yank the net upward, hoisting the soldier into the air or immobilizing him against nearby branches or poles. Imagine walking cautiously through dense jungle, heart pounding, scanning for tripwires or snipers, only to suddenly be ripped off the ground and left dangling, disoriented, and completely exposed. These traps were often paired with other threats like punji sticks beneath the net or nearby ambush positions, making the captured soldier a sitting duck for further attack. They were designed to create chaos within a unit, forcing fellow soldiers to abandon cover and potentially walk into danger themselves. One chilling example of this tactic occurred during Operation Attleboro in 1966 in the province of Tay Ninh. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a US infantryman, recalled the shock of being caught by a net trap. "It happened so fast I didn't even know what hit me. One moment I was walking, the next I was swinging from a tree. It was like the jungle itself had grabbed me." Fortunately for O'Brien, his squad was nearby and able to cut him down quickly, but the psychological impact was lasting. For him and everyone who saw it. Then there were the pitfall traps, arguably among the most feared weapons in the Viet Cong arsenal. These pits were cleverly disguised holes dug into jungle trails, often several feet deep and filled with sharp bamboo spikes, broken metal, or even glass shards. The tops were covered with thin layers of brush or soil, making them indistinguishable from solid ground. A single misstep meant plunging feet first into a hole designed to maim, disable, or kill. One of the most feared variants was the tiger trap, a deep pit lined with multiple sharpened bamboo stakes pointing upward and sometimes inward at angles. These stakes were often coated in poison or human waste to increase the chances of infection and prevent quick recovery. Even if the impaled soldier survived the fall, the wounds were often gruesome, requiring immediate medical evacuation and sometimes leading to amputations. The psychological effect of these traps was immense. Soldiers became hypervigilant, second-guessing every step. Movement slowed, anxiety levels soared, trust in the terrain, and even in comrades who might have missed a hidden pit, diminished. A harrowing account comes from Lieutenant Gran Man Tuan, a South Vietnamese officer. "I saw a friend of mine fall into a tiger trap. The stakes pierced both legs. We couldn't pull him out without making it worse. We had to call in a medevac chopper. It took hours to get him out safely." That trauma lingered. The thought of being helpless at the bottom of a pit, bleeding, impaled, and trapped, haunted soldiers long after the event, and that was the point. The Viet Cong didn't just want to injure, they wanted to terrorize. Their mastery of terrain-based warfare turned the very ground under soldiers' boots into a threat. Every step was a gamble. Every clearing, every trail, every fallen branch could be a facade covering something deadly. Together, net traps and pitfall traps exemplified how the Viet Cong turned low-tech tools into high-impact weapons, changing the rules of combat and rewriting the psychology of fear in the jungle. The use of poisonous creatures and sabotage by the Viet Cong. In their relentless pursuit of psychological dominance, the Viet Cong went beyond traditional warfare. They wielded nature itself as a weapon, transforming the dense Vietnamese jungles into a living nightmare. From deploying venomous animals to poisoning food and water supplies, the Viet Cong's tactics were designed not just to injure, but to terrify, destabilize, and mentally exhaust their enemies. Among their most insidious strategies was the use of deadly creatures. The jungles of Vietnam were already teeming with venomous snakes and scorpions, but the Viet Cong weaponized them, turning a natural threat into a calculated instrument of war. Snakes, such as bamboo vipers, king cobras, and kraits, were deliberately captured and placed in hidden compartments, foxholes, and even inside enemy camps. Some traps were rigged with small bamboo cages that would release a snake when disturbed. Others were even more personal, placing snakes or scorpions in soldiers' sleeping bags or backpacks, ensuring a horrifying wake-up call and often a fatal bite. One particularly infamous tactic involved placing snakes inside helmets or canteens, waiting for an unsuspecting soldier to reach in. The psychological effect was immediate. Even in moments of rest or routine, danger lurked within reach. A chilling example comes from Corporal John Harker, a US Marine who was on patrol in Quang Tri Province in 1967. As he pushed through thick underbrush, he felt a sharp jab in his arm. A sharp sting. Then I saw the snake slither away. Within minutes, my arm went numb and I couldn't move it. Panic set in. Fortunately, his fellow Marines applied a tourniquet and called for an emergency medevac. Harker survived, but the encounter left him with a lifelong fear of snakes and a new understanding of the unpredictable, terrifying nature of jungle warfare. But the Viet Cong didn't stop at snakes and scorpions. They took their war to the most basic human needs: food and water. In a landscape where soldiers were constantly hot, tired, and hungry, these were their only sources of comfort, and the Viet Cong poisoned them. When retreating from an area, Viet Cong units often left behind booby-trapped food supplies or water containers. Sometimes the contamination was done using local plant toxins. Other times it was chemical, odorous and tasteless but potent. The goal was clear: to create paranoia, erode trust, and make every meal feel like a gamble. One documented case occurred in 1968, deep in the Mekong Delta. A unit of South Vietnamese soldiers came across a seemingly abandoned Viet Cong rice cache. Starving and exhausted, they consumed it, only to be struck down with violent gastrointestinal distress. Although no lives were lost, the incident triggered a complete change in protocol. From then on, all found food and water had to be inspected or destroyed. Trust in scavenged resources vanished. Beyond the physical danger, these tactics created a sense of deep psychological instability. Soldiers could no longer rely on their instincts. What looked safe could be deadly. What felt like relief, food, water, rest, could be the beginning of a trap. The Viet Cong didn't just use these techniques against outsiders. In some instances, they turned them inward, on their own ranks. Reports emerged of internal discipline within the Viet Cong being enforced through threats of poisoning. For suspected deserters or traitors, the punishment wasn't immediate execution. It was fear. Fear that the next meal might be their last. One former Viet Cong fighter, Nguyen Thi Lan, who later defected, recalled a terrifying warning: "If you betray us or try to escape, we'll find you, and we'll make sure that every meal you eat could be your last." The result was total control through psychological terror. Loyalty wasn't just expected. It was enforced with a shadowy threat of slow, silent, painful death. These tactics, while horrifying, were brilliant in their psychological design. They tapped into primal fears of snakes, of poison, of betrayal, of unseen death. They made every corner of the jungle dangerous, every bush a potential attacker, every sip of water a potential trap. And in doing so, the Viet Cong not only fought a war of bullets and bombs, but a war of nerves, one that left lasting scars long after the wounds had healed. The silent threat: Viet Cong wire traps. Among the terrifying and inventive arsenal deployed by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War, wire traps stood out for their deadly simplicity, psychological impact, and frequent effectiveness. These silent killers, often invisible until it was far too late, were designed to maim, incapacitate, or kill with shocking speed, all while blending perfectly into the chaotic environment of the jungle. The Viet Cong were masters at using basic materials in lethal ways. With little more than a length of wire, a bent tree branch, and something sharp, they could build a trap that would ruin a soldier's body and his sense of safety with one misstep. Spring traps, the bamboo whip of death. One of the most feared wire-based devices was the spring trap, also known as the bamboo whip trap. The concept was simple: but the result was devastating. Here's how it worked. A piece of bamboo or a tree branch was bent and held under tension using a wire. At the end of this makeshift whip, the Viet Cong would attach a sharp metal hook, wooden stake, or cluster of spikes. The wire was then rigged to a tripwire stretched across a trail or tied to natural terrain elements like roots or foliage. When a soldier unknowingly stepped on or tripped the wire, the tension would release, unleashing the branch with explosive force, sending the sharpened weapon flying into the victim's body. These weapons often targeted the torso, face, or legs, making even non-lethal injuries deeply traumatic and debilitating. A chilling example comes from Private First Class James O'Neill, who recounted his experience during a jungle patrol in Binh Dinh province in 1966. "I didn't even see the wire until it was too late. All I remember is a sharp sting in my leg, then blood. A hook had buried itself into my calf. I couldn't walk. My buddies had to carry me out." O'Neill survived, but the trauma lingered. His story became one of countless testimonies, highlighting just how terrifying it was to move through Viet Cong territory, where any step could trigger an unseen whip of death. Slide traps, gravity as a weapon. Another wire-based horror came in the form of slide traps. These were engineered to use gravity and terrain against the victim, often with deadly consequences. Slide traps were generally placed along jungle slopes, ravines, or narrow mountain passes. The trap began with a tripwire, disguised and strategically placed at the top of a slope. Once triggered, the victim would lose balance and slip down a slick, often greased or smoothed incline covered with camouflaged leaves and dirt. At the bottom, a pit filled with punji sticks, sharpened bamboo or metal spikes. The cruel genius of the trap was that once you lost footing, there was no way to stop the descent. Injuries from these traps were catastrophic: puncture wounds, impalements, broken limbs, and they happened so fast the victim often couldn't even scream before impact. A haunting story comes from Lieutenant Tran Quoc, a South Vietnamese officer who witnessed such a trap in 1970. "We were moving through the jungle in Vu Lac when one of my men tripped a wire. The ground beneath him gave way, and he slid into a pit full of sharpened bamboo stakes. We couldn't save him. The image of his body, impaled, motionless, never left my mind." This kind of trauma left deep mental scars, even on seasoned soldiers. The Viet Cong's traps were designed not just to wound bodies, but to fracture morale, to make every movement feel like a gamble and every mistake irreversible. Why wire traps worked so well? The effectiveness of these traps lay in three core principles. 1. Simplicity. These devices required minimal materials and could be constructed quickly and repeatedly. 2. Stealth. The thinness and camouflage of the tripwires made them nearly impossible to detect in the thick undergrowth. 3. Psychological impact. Beyond physical harm, they created a persistent fear of the invisible. Soldiers became hesitant, tense, distracted, exactly the state the Viet Cong wanted them in. Even when no one was injured, the discovery of a triggered or avoided trap was enough to halt entire units, throw off timetables, and cause internal friction. In a war that depended heavily on endurance and momentum, wire traps slowed everything down and increased casualties without direct confrontation. Living with the threat. For American and South Vietnamese forces, adapting meant constant vigilance. Soldiers were trained to spot subtle terrain changes, and scouts were often sent ahead to sweep trails with sticks or mine detectors. But even with training, many traps were simply too well hidden to detect until it was too late. Veterans often speak of the constant mental exhaustion these traps induced. It wasn't just fighting an enemy, it was fighting the ground, the trees, the trail itself. And in the Vietnam War, where the line between safety and death was razor thin, the Viet Cong's wire traps became the ultimate symbol of hidden danger, an unseen enemy waiting patiently beneath the jungle canopy. Disarming the Viet Cong traps. As US and South Vietnamese forces faced the relentless and ever-present threat of the Viet Cong's deadly traps, they quickly realized that brute strength alone wouldn't be enough. To survive in a battlefield where the enemy was often invisible and the terrain itself was weaponized, they needed innovation, adaptation, and resilience. Every footstep could be the last. Every rustle in the brush, every inch of disturbed soil, every seemingly innocent log could conceal a fatal device. The psychological toll was immense, and it was clear that without a structured response, the traps would continue to bleed morale and manpower. the beginning of countermeasures. One of the pivotal figures in the battle against these hidden horrors was Captain Ernest "Ernie" Brace, a U.S. Army engineer who arrived in Vietnam in 1963. Brace, horrified by the number of casualties caused by booby traps, made it his mission to understand and neutralize these terrifying weapons. He didn't begin with sophisticated technology. Instead, he started with basic field investigation, examining captured traps, working with local allies, and mapping out common designs and techniques used by the Viet Cong. What emerged from his research was a practical and vital system of countermeasures that would change the course of ground operations in Vietnam. The human element, training, and awareness. Captain Brace's most immediate priority was training. He and his team developed protocols to teach soldiers how to spot telltale signs of booby traps, discolored soil, freshly cut vegetation, unnatural stick placements, unusual silence in the jungle, and poorly concealed tripwires. These weren't high-tech solutions. They were behavioral. Brace emphasized moving slowly and carefully, especially through dense terrain, communicating constantly, sharing potential warning signs across squads, avoiding predictable paths since Viet Cong traps were most often placed along known routes. With repetition and practice, these habits became second nature to many troops, greatly reducing the number of surprise injuries and deaths. The trap probe, a simple yet life-saving tool. One of the most critical tools developed in this fight was the trap probe. This was a long, slender rod of metal with a curved tip, issued to troops to gently poke and prod the ground in front of them. The probe allowed soldiers to feel for hidden objects buried just beneath the surface, tripwires, pressure plates, spikes, without triggering the trap itself. Troops learned to move in crouched stances, sweeping their probes back and forth like cautious archaeologists uncovering ancient artifacts. Only these artifacts could kill. In many instances, the trap probe was the thin line between life and death, and it became a standard part of jungle patrol gear. Four-legged heroes, canine detection units. In the war against the unseen, dogs became warriors in their own right. Specially trained canines, mostly German shepherds and Labrador retrievers, were brought to the front lines. Their noses, thousands of times more sensitive than a human's, were trained to detect the scent of disturbed soil, human sweat, or gunpowder, all potential signs of a hidden trap or tunnel. These dogs saved countless lives, alerting their handlers to dangers that no human eye could spot. They were silent protectors moving ahead of the troops, sniffing out invisible death. Beyond their operational role, these dogs also became a source of emotional support in an environment defined by constant anxiety. In moments of chaos, their calm presence reminded soldiers they were not alone. Technological innovations and equipment development. Back home, engineers and military scientists in the US raced to find better ways to protect their soldiers from the Viet Cong's deadly ingenuity. The results were both creative and essential. Lightweight body armor, designed to offer more flexibility and reduce fatigue while still providing critical protection. Puncture-resistant boots, reinforced soles and layered materials protected against spike traps like punji sticks. Advanced helmets. With new materials and reinforced linings, these helmets offered better defense against low-trajectory traps or flying debris from spring-loaded mechanisms. Field feedback directly influenced many of these innovations. When soldiers encountered a new kind of trap, reports would go back to command and be forwarded to engineers, who would refine gear accordingly. This rapid feedback loop between the field and the lab saved lives, and also highlighted the growing importance of technology in modern warfare. A war of wits. In the end, the war against Viet Cong traps was not won through firepower, but through knowledge, vigilance, and constant adaptation. What the US and South Vietnamese forces lacked in surprise and terrain familiarity, they made up for with ingenuity and discipline. By training soldiers to think like their enemies, giving them tools to detect invisible threats, and deploying loyal canines to sniff out danger, they began to slowly tilt the odds in their favor. However, the scars remained. For those who patrolled the jungles of Vietnam, the fear of unseen death never truly went away. But thanks to the combined efforts of engineers, handlers, and frontline troops, thousands of lives were saved, and a blueprint was written for future armies facing asymmetric warfare in hostile terrain, a historical tapestry of deception in warfare. Throughout history, deception has served as one of the most potent weapons in military strategy. While the Viet Cong's use of guerrilla tactics and elaborate traps during the Vietnam War stands as a chilling example of psychological and tactical warfare, They were far from the first to wield deception as a strategic blade. From ancient battles to modern wars, deception has shaped outcomes, influenced tactics, and often determined the victor, not through brute force, but through cunning and illusion. Korea, the Forgotten War of Shadows. The Korean War, 1950-1953, was another theatre where deception played a vital role. Both North and South Korea, along with their allies, engaged in various deceptive strategies. North Korean forces, for example, concealed artillery and supply caches in camouflaged bunkers or blended them into natural terrain. These hiding spots were virtually invisible to aerial reconnaissance. They also conducted swift, hit-and-run attacks, leveraging their knowledge of the rugged Korean terrain to strike with surprise and vanish just as quickly, mirroring the later guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong. On the other hand, South Korean and UN forces employed misinformation campaigns, intercepting and confusing enemy communication channels. One of the most remarkable deception operations was Operation Moolah by the United Nations, which aimed to coerce North Korean pilots to defect with their MiG-15 fighters by broadcasting offers of political asylum and financial rewards. Though few took the bait, it instilled doubt and paranoia within enemy ranks. World War II, the golden age of deception. During World War II, deception reached a sophisticated and theatrical level. The US created a ghost army, an entire unit equipped not with weapons, but with inflatable tanks, fake radio chatter, and sound effects. Their mission? To trick German forces into thinking large divisions were stationed in fake locations. The British intelligence community ran Operation Mincemeat, perhaps one of the most cunning deceptions of the war. They planted false invasion plans on a corpse dressed as a British officer and let the body wash up on the Spanish coast, where it would inevitably fall into German hands. The Nazis took the bait and redirected troops away from the real Allied invasion target, Sicily. Such efforts weren't just clever, they were war-changing. Ancient warfare, the Trojan horse and beyond. Even long before modern warfare, deception was a central element of battle strategy. The legendary Trojan horse, chronicled in Homer's The Iliad, was a brilliant ruse. The Greeks, unable to breach the walls of Troy, feigned surrender and gifted a massive wooden horse. Unbeknownst to the Trojans, the horse was filled with elite Greek warriors. Once inside the city walls, they emerged at night to open the gates, leading to Troy's fall. In ancient China, the military treatise The Art of War by Sun Tzu made deception a cornerstone of successful strategy. His maxim, "All warfare is based on deception," echoes across centuries of conflict. Whether by shadow or suggestion, deception has been a timeless companion to warfare, shaping victories and leaving legacies far more psychological than physical. Echoes of war, the lasting impact of Viet Cong. Traps on soldiers and the land. The traps left behind by the Viet Cong were not simply tools of war. They became haunting symbols of a conflict that shattered bodies and minds alike. Their presence on the battlefield had devastating consequences for American and South Vietnamese soldiers, and their remnants still echo across the landscape of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos today. Physical toll on the front lines. For troops navigating the dense jungles of Vietnam, the constant threat of hidden traps created a daily battle with paranoia. A simple step off the trail might trigger a punji pit, slicing through flesh and exposing the victim to deadly infections. A brush against a bush could snap a spring trap, impaling a leg or arm. Even routine activities like opening a door or sitting on a log could end in tragedy. The psychological effect was profound. Many soldiers reported heightened anxiety, sleep disorders, and emotional exhaustion. The fear was relentless. The jungle itself was the enemy, one veteran recalled. It wasn't just the visible Viet Cong that posed a threat. It was every rock, every tree, every step. Tactical shifts and strategic consequences. The sheer effectiveness of these traps forced US and South Vietnamese forces to adapt rapidly. Traditional battle formations and direct engagement strategies proved ineffective. Instead, they shifted to small unit patrols that could move stealthily and scan for traps. Increased reliance on reconnaissance to map out possible trap locations. Use of engineers and sappers to disarm or detonate traps before infantry advanced. But this shift had its cost. These new tactics slowed down operations, placed enormous strain on individual soldiers, and often left units more isolated and vulnerable. The land left scarred. Even after the war, the deadly legacy of these traps remained. Unexploded mines, rigged grenades, and rotting bamboo spikes still lie hidden in rice fields, forests, and near old combat zones. Civilians living in these regions continue to suffer. In Cambodia, Laos, and rural Vietnam, farmers lose limbs plowing fields. Children stumble upon traps while playing. Entire villages avoid certain areas known to be haunted by the war. One particularly powerful story is that of Aki Ra, a former Khmer Rouge child soldier. After the war, he dedicated his life to clearing landmines and booby traps, ultimately founding the Cambodian Landmine Museum and Relief Center. His work has saved thousands of lives and brought global awareness to the lingering horror of post-war traps. Psychological fallout among veterans. The trauma didn't end when soldiers returned home. For many, the jungle came with them. Nightmares, flashbacks of fallen comrades, survivor's guilt, fear of confined spaces often linked to tunnel traps. This lingering trauma contributed heavily to PTSD rates among Vietnam War veterans. Organizations like Vietnam Veterans of America have worked tirelessly to provide mental health resources, therapy, and advocacy for those still haunted by what they saw and what they stepped into. A grim reminder. These traps were never about the size of the blast or the volume of blood. They were about fear, about turning every corner into a question, about making every soldier wonder, is this step my last? That is the true legacy of the Viet Cong's tactics. Not just the pain they caused, but the way they reshaped warfare, rewrote battlefield rules, and left permanent scars on land and soul alike. Voices from the hidden dangers of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a conflict filled with danger and uncertainty. The widespread use of traps by the Viet Cong only intensified the fear experienced by soldiers on the ground. These were not just physical threats. They were psychological weapons that turned every step into a potential death trap. To truly grasp the impact of these hidden dangers, we must turn to the voices of those who lived through them. One such voice is that of John Thompson, a U.S. Army veteran who served in Vietnam from 1968 to 1969. He remembers the day his platoon was sent into the jungle to investigate a suspected Viet Cong supply depot. As they carefully moved through the dense foliage, one of his fellow soldiers accidentally triggered a tripwire. In an instant, a hidden explosive was set off. The blast left his comrades seriously wounded. For Thompson, that moment became an unforgettable reminder of the war's ever-present danger. "You never knew where they were," he later said. "It felt like they were everywhere. That was the scariest part of the war for me." Another harrowing experience comes from James Walker, a veteran who served as part of a reconnaissance patrol. His mission was to move quietly through thick jungle terrain to monitor enemy activity. On one mission, he suddenly felt a sharp tug on his leg, followed by intense pain. A hidden wire trap had caused a bamboo stake to pierce his calf. The incident left him not only physically injured, but mentally scarred. From that day on, the fear of unseen threats haunted every step he took. Patricia Johnson, a field nurse during the war, shared her experiences from the medical tents. She often treated soldiers who had been victims of the Viet Cong's brutal traps. One case that stayed with her was a young South Vietnamese soldier who had fallen into a trap filled with venomous snakes. Despite being rushed to the hospital, the multiple snake bites overwhelmed his body, and he succumbed to the venom. Johnson recalled the overwhelming sense of helplessness she and her fellow medics felt in the face of such cruel and unpredictable weapons. Perhaps the most chilling story comes from Charles Nguyen, a former South Vietnamese soldier who eventually moved to the United States. During the war, he was captured by the Viet Cong. While in captivity, he was forced to witness an act of psychological torture. Scorpions were placed into small bamboo cages and strapped around the necks of his fellow soldiers. The prisoners were then left to endure the agony of repeated stings. This brutal display of cruelty left an indelible mark on Nguyen's memory. Even after his release, the horror of that night remained etched in his mind. These stories serve as a stark reminder of the hidden dangers faced by those who fought in Vietnam. The Viet Cong's resourcefulness in creating deadly traps from natural materials was matched only by the bravery of the men and women who confronted them. Their ingenuity turned the very environment into a weapon, while the soldiers' resilience became a symbol of human endurance under extreme stress. As General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces during the war, once said, "War is fear wrapped in courage." The personal accounts shared here are powerful testaments to that truth. They reveal how fear and bravery walked hand in hand through the jungles of Vietnam. Reflecting on these hidden dangers and their lasting impact, we're reminded of the sacrifice, strength, and unwavering spirit of those who face the unknown, one perilous step at a time.